onto chat. We'll then have the questions asked right then and there. But before we do something like that, I want to see if I can pull this off. Before we start, there's a little video I want to show you, and this worked so well in rehearsal. Let's hope that it works right now. So. Evidently,
you know, Mark, I think we're fine without it. If you can't get it to run, it's just 2 minutes.
I had it there, and I don't know what became of it. So without further ado, if you would mute themselves, and would you welcome Ann Gardiner Perkins, the author? And Ann, can you get us started by telling us a bit about your book, Yale Needs Women?
Absolutely.
And the history of coeducation in this country, and of coeducation in the Ivy League in particular.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Mark. So this is so exciting. Over the next hour, we're all going to explore together that moment in America's history when Yale and its peers, when America's most prestigious colleges finally admitted women students. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, that moment was just 50 years ago, close enough that we can touch it, which is why we're so lucky tonight to be able to include Elizabeth Spahn and Connie Royster, two of Yale's first women undergraduates, in our program. But before I begin, just some two thanks are in order. First of all, to Mark Schmidt and Falmouth Museums on the Green, who have just been terrific sponsors and hosts. It's been delightful to work with you, Mark, and to Eight Cousins Bookstores. I know in my community how important the independent bookstore is, and independent bookstores have taken a real hit economically over the last 3 months. So I would really encourage you to support Eight Cousins Books and your local independent bookstores. They all have their books available online. So a bit of a game plan. I'm going to give you a brief overview just to give you a context of this history. And then Connie and Elizabeth and I are going to talk for about a half an hour. So think of it as being able to watch a live interview with two of Yale's first women undergraduates. And then we'll open it up to questions and look to close right on time at 8 o'clock. Let's see how that goes. So let's turn back to 1969 when those first women students arrived at Yale. Yale Needs Women is the story of those first women undergraduates. They arrived to a campus that had been all male for the previous 268 years. They were outnumbered 7-to-1 by their male classmates. So don't think coeducation is 50-50 or even close to it like it is now, because Yale put in place a gender quota that limited the number of women graduates. It wanted to be able to continue to admit as many men as possible. And those young women students didn't have women faculty to look out for them either. Of Yale's 407 tenured faculty members in 1969, just 3 were women. But of the dozens of women I interviewed in writing this book, I was struck really again and again by their persistence, by their courage, and by their creativity. Now, if we think of September 1969, in some ways, it's really been reminding me of our time right now, when lots of individuals were speaking out against longstanding injustice. The Vietnam War was raging, as was the protest against it. The Black Power movement was changing how Americans saw race. The Stonewall riots had just happened right before those first women students arrived. So sort of showing people the discrimination faced by gay and transgender men and women. And it's into that moment that Connie and Elizabeth, that those first women undergraduates at Yale arrive. Now, the women's movement had barely started just then. And so to give you some of that context, just 7% of US doctors in 1969 were women, just 3% of US lawyers, just 2% of the members of Congress. Discrimination against women college students, faculty, and administrators was perfectly legal. And if you think Yale was the only college that was turning women away at that time, you should think again. It really is the entire top tier of American colleges and universities, with some rare exceptions. 7 of the 8 Ivy League schools, even 2 public universities. It almost reads like a list of sort of who's who, from Amherst, Bowdoin, Brown, Dartmouth, and Duke at the start of the alphabet, to UVA, Wesleyan, West Point, Williams, and of course Yale at its end. So when Yale finally announces that it's going co-ed, the news is so shocking that the New York Times plays it on the front page. 10 months later, those first women students arrived, yet if Yale's President Kingman Brewster had had his way, Yale would never have admitted women at all. So what were those first women students like? The New York Times called them superwomen, but most of them were just teenagers. Some were wealthy, but others had to patch together their tuition through summer jobs and financial aid work on campus. Most of them were white, but 40 of those first women students at Yale College were Black, 13 were Asian American, 3 were Latina. They were smart and they were tough. That's how Yale picked them. Yale looked that first year for women who played on sports teams, women who had traveled abroad, women who had endured some sort of hardship, women who had lots of brothers. I interviewed one of the 2 administrators who selected that first class of women at Yale, and I'll never forget what he told me. There was no point in taking a timid woman and putting her in this environment because it could crush you. So they were smart and they were tough. And tonight you get to hear from 2 of those women, Connie Royster, Constance Royster, and Elizabeth Spahn. So Connie and Elizabeth arrive at Yale in the fall of 1969 as sophomore transfer students. Yale took a group of freshman women that first year, a group of sophomore transfers, and a group of junior transfers. Connie had transferred from Wheaton College here in Massachusetts, in Norton, Massachusetts, and Elizabeth from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Both of them graduated right on time in 1972, and both went on to become lawyers. Elizabeth worked as the professor of American constitutional law at New England School of Law in Boston, and lectured broadly, both nationally and internationally throughout her career. And Connie had a distinguished legal career in New York City before returning to Yale as the development director at Yale's Divinity School. So Connie, why don't I begin with you? And just an observation, for many of the first women students, arriving at Yale was like arriving on a foreign planet. Between it being all male, and for many, the wealth of the place was really overwhelming. And many are coming from small towns or from the West Coast. And so New Haven and Yale seemed very foreign. But for you, it felt more like being at home. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So it was very much like coming home. Indeed, I was born and raised in New Haven, although I had been away. So New Haven was hometown to me. The church that I grew up in was just a couple of blocks up Whaley Avenue. I went to New Haven public schools up through the 9th grade, more or less, and then I went away to boarding school, and then a year in England, and then a year at Wheaton. So it was like coming home. Moreover, my family had worked in Yale fraternities for, at that point, half a century at least. My maternal side had emigrated to New Haven in the beginning of the 1900s, and immediately started working in the fraternities along Fraternity Row. If any of you are Yaleys, you will know what I'm talking about. Fraternity Row on York Street, starting with, Wolf's Head and Fence Club and Beta and Theta. They were all managed by my uncles and cousins, and so there was a long history of my family being at Yale, including my grandfather, who was the chef at Skull and Bones. So I knew New Haven and I knew Yale very, very well. So coming back to New Haven, my mother and father, my sister lived just outside New Haven. They had moved out to the suburbs when I was, while I was away at boarding school. And coming back, my cousins and uncles were still in management at the fraternities. And so I would ride my bicycle through Fraternity Row, and they would come out and greet me and say, how is it going? And how are you doing? And it was a very protective feeling. And so I was literally coming home and feeling very good about it.
Connie, your grandfather was no longer living when you were accepted, but wasn't there a story about one of your aunts said to you about that?
That is true. So first of all, as a woman coming to Yale, no one ever thought that, that women were ever going to go to Yale, let's face it. And certainly not in an African-American family in New Haven. That was just totally unheard of. And so when I was accepted, one of my aunts said to me that my grandfather, and I was a favorite granddaughter, my aunt said, oh, my daughter, your grandfather is rolling over in his grave thinking about his granddaughter going to Yale. And because, as a little girl, I was going over into the, when my parents would help serve meals at big occasions, we'd all go and, because everybody had to go, everybody had to help. And so I would crawl around on the floor in the kitchen, and he was always so pleased and happy about the grandchildren and of me. And she just thought he is like just rolling over with joy that his granddaughter was at Yale.
I love that. So Elizabeth, you and Connie were roommates that first year, and here you come from Illinois. Can you tell us a little about the story of how the two of you met?
Don't you want to hear about my background too?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Listening to Connie, we could not be more opposite. She was coming home and felt safe and protected, and I was an alien from a different planet. I come from the Midwest. I come from a small town in Illinois. I went to public school, not elite boarding schools. My family did not know I had applied to Yale. I didn't know I'd applied to Yale. My roommates at GW applied for me. I thought Yale was in Boston. My family did not want me to go to Yale. And when I arrived, I was just dropped off in the courtyard and, lugged my one suitcase up the stairs and stood in this empty room. There was no furniture. And I mean, there wasn't a chair, or there was no furniture. And Connie comes in, with her entourage, her parents, and they immediately begin furnishing the place. They take us to the Salvation Army and we start buying used furniture. Connie knew what she was doing. I had no clue. Connie felt safe and protected. I felt unsafe and really we could not be more opposite. And yet, when we stood in that living room, she walked in the door, and it was one of those moments, I think almost all of us has had them, the French call it a coup de cœur, where you just know this is my best friend. And this is going to be my best friend forever. And I think she's always been my best friend. And I know she still is my best friend. And, you know, we became bonded in a way that I don't really know how to explain, except that I'm sure most of you have had that experience. So two more opposite people, and yet we did bond. And for that, I will always be grateful to Yale.
That's wonderful. So, Connie, you come to Yale interested in the arts, interested in drama, and you get involved in the theater there, which was very unusual because many of the extracurricular activities at Yale, either women weren't allowed at all, or they're sort of given the position against some of the leftist groups of typing up the pamphlets, but not being given leadership roles. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like in the theater community?
Yeah, so I came to Yale. I didn't know that that was going to be my my place, except that I came with that background. I had gone to a boarding school where the arts were very important. It was part of the education that we be educated in, you know, in all of the arts. And then when I was at Wheaton, I just jumped right into theater. I mean, I just had an amazing experience. And in fact, when I applied to Yale from Wheaton, I did it because, well, why not? I mean, you know, Yale was going co-ed. Let's just give it a shot. But if I had not gotten in, I would have been perfectly happy at Yale, at Wheaton. I loved Wheaton. So coming to Yale, I came with this wealth of a year at Wheaton immersed in theater activities. When I got to Yale, I thought theater was going to be, you know, an extracurricular, but I found a cohort that became, you know, very much part of my life. So much so that I transferred out of Berkeley College, which was where I started, to Jonathan Edwards, because that's where my theater and music friends were. And because there really was no undergraduate major in drama, we spent a lot of time in the drama school, being taught by and mentored by professors and practitioners in the drama school. And so we became a very close theatrical community. And I think that if Yale had then what I would call a humanities major, a true, just like liberal arts major, that's probably what I would have done. I think they do now have a humanities major, just 50 years later, unfortunately. But I did a lot of theater and a lot of art history and a lot of music, and it was a wonderfully embracing community, which meant, I think, that I did not experience some of the horror stories that you, I'm sure, heard as you wrote the book about, some of the women who were in some of the more traditional disciplines where women were not particularly welcome or accepted. My experience was really wonderful, actually.
Which is terrific. Now, Elizabeth, so Connie is off practicing for this play and that play all the time. And when you're not working at your campus job or eventually working at the post office to earn money, and when you're not studying, you're involved in politics. And you were one of the 2 women who founded the Yale Sisterhood, which is Yale's first women's group, and you were very involved in the Women's Center in that group. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how different the whole culture of that women's group was than the culture at Yale?
Coming from the Midwest and coming from co-educated public schools, it had never occurred to me that women shouldn't be educated or shouldn't be educated to the maximum of their ability. My mother's a teacher, my grandmother's a college graduate. Women are, of course, educated. And I arrived at Yale and discovered that this was a controversial topic and that we were still, struggling our way into the 18th century. And that there were a lot of people at Yale, a lot of men at Yale who, of all ages, faculty and students, who really didn't think women should be getting a Yale education, or who said it's okay for them to get a Yale education, it will help them raise their sons. So it was a heavily masculine, and at that time, in 1969, there was a lot going on, but the feminist movement really wasn't, it was just in its very early stages. So there's another woman who may be on the call here, I can't see, Kit McClure, and I just went around and stapled up some notices and said, let's get together, the women, because there was no place for the women, the co-education classes, for us to meet each other. We were scattered around among the then 12 residential colleges, and we had no place. We didn't know each other. Many of us to this day still don't know each other, although some of the reunions have helped that. So we started, Kit and I just started putting up notices, and we're just astonished with what an amazing reaction. There were, sometimes 60 women would come and sit around, and we would talk. And during this period of time, we worked in a format called consciousness raising groups, where people would take turns discussing things, and we would share our experiences. And I can remember hearing for the first time, about from women who had been maybe beaten at home or who had been raped. We just didn't talk in the Midwest. We just didn't talk about those things. And I really had no idea this was going on. We also just shared some of our experiences and found out that a lot of us were having the same experience in the classroom, which is we'd make a statement and then the discussion would continue on as if we hadn't spoken. And 5 minutes later, a man would make the same, a male student would make the same point, and everybody'd say how smart he was. So, and when I thought I wasn't articulate enough, but then Dahlia Rudofsky was having the same problem, and I knew Dahlia was smart enough and articulate enough. And then Judy Burkhan said, so it turned out more of us were having this problem. It wasn't just me. It turned out some of the women were survivors now, what we would now call survivors of rape or incest. But at that time, you really couldn't talk about it. And it was such an amazing group of people. The last thing I want to say about the Women's Center is that we worked very closely together with the New Haven Women's Liberation Center. And a lot of this was because of Kit's connections there. But we had a connection to the town, to the city of New Haven that I didn't find in other Yale organizations frequently, although the Mayday demonstrations certainly knit us together with the town closely. But the Women's Center really focused on women's issues that were not limited to Yale. It had a much broader context. And for me, it was the single, well, other than meeting Connie, the single most important substantive event of my time at Yale.
Yeah, and it's so interesting what you say, Elizabeth, about that connection with the community, because there really was a town-gown divide between wealthy Yale and the New Haven neighborhoods that surrounded it. And it was the Women's Center, the Sisterhood, and the Black Student Alliance at Yale. Both of those groups sort of violated those taboos against working with townspeople and helped build those bridges. Just one more other thought on what you're saying about Midwesterners didn't talk about it. I mean, when we think about it, you all started at Yale before the term date rape had even been invented, before the term sexual harassment, that term hadn't been invented yet. It didn't mean it wasn't going on, but there wasn't even a language yet. to talk about that. Now,
And it
you
wasn't
mentioned,
illegal. Sexual harassment was not illegal yet.
right, and it took a case brought by Yale women
Mhm.
that made sexual harassment illegal on college campuses. You brought up Mayday, and I've certainly been thinking about that a lot. And for those of you who don't know the background, in May of 1970, there was a major national trial at the New Haven City Courthouse, which is 2 blocks from the Yale campus. It was a trial of a group of Black Panthers, Erica Huggins, who was a Black Panther leader in the city of New Haven, Bobby Seale, who was a national Black Panther leader, and protesters from across the nation came into Yale to protest what was seen as a trumped up trial, and indeed eventually both the charges against Huggins and Bobby Seale were dismissed. It was a very tense time on the Yale campus. The National Guard came in. People were seeing Army tanks driving down the streets right next to New Haven dormitories. Many students left, some stayed. Connie, both you and Elizabeth stayed at Yale over Mayday. And Connie, want to talk to me a little bit about what you did as part of that?
It was a tense time, but it was an extraordinary time. I mean, I think some of what's going on right now is really reminiscent of what those times were like, frankly. It right now raises a whole host of emotions and anger and just visceral feelings about what's going on in this country right now, as it did back then, which had a lot to do with racism and the war and people being killed mercilessly. And so there were lots of reasons to be demonstrating in support of the Panther trial, which is what we called it, and to have the support, as it were, of the university behind us. It was a moral statement that was made that made us actually feel good about where we were. So some people left. The university effectively closed down. Classes were canceled for the most part. We had pass-fail, and I mean, there were some nuances, I suppose, that 50 years later nobody remembers in full detail, but classes were canceled. You had, people stayed, the dorms were still open, but every college essentially had a role to play, and you were free to participate in whatever way you felt you could, which ranged from, feeding the thousands of people who arrived in New Haven, to participating as peace marshals. I think Betty was working on that, to participating in the daycare of children who arrived with parents who were participating in demonstrations, to you still have to have some forms of entertainment. And because I was in the theater part of things, we did a big theater production in the main stage of the university theater. And so there were a group of us, actually a large group of us, made up of undergraduates and drama school participants, mostly Black, who did an original production of relevant to the times. And so, everybody could participate in whatever way they felt would be meaningful to them. And it was learning civics on the ground. It was it was probably the most significant learning experience of the 3 years that I was there. It so happened that in year 2 of being there, there was another strike. It was the labor union was having a fight with Yale for a change, and so there was a strike the second year as well. And so we really had an extraordinary 3 years, 2 of which were civic lessons, I would have to say. But I had friends who did not stay on campus, very close friends, who chose to leave either because their parents said, you get the hell off that campus and come home, or because they felt that that they couldn't really relate to what was going on. And so, everybody had to make their own decisions.
Right, Connie and Elizabeth, I'm looking at the time now, but I thought maybe what we can do, Elizabeth, is have you tell us a little bit about your group in the sisterhood and the Peace Marshals, and then we'll turn it over to Mark to field some questions from the audience, because that Peace Marshal role at Yale really was quite remarkable. And I love the story of how you all were trained.
Well, the challenge, and we're seeing this again today with the Black Lives Matter protests, the challenge is when you organize peaceful protests, that people come in who are intent on disrupting it in a variety of ways. And sometimes I'm just going to call them outside agitators, are simply opportunistic, and they want to loot a liquor store because they want some liquor. But more often, the outside agitators are deliberately trying to turn the peaceful demonstration violent in order to discredit it. And this technique was had been used a lot in the anti-war demonstrations, where peaceful anti-war demonstrations had been disrupted by violent right-wing extremists posing as if they were peace protesters. The Panthers had an even much more serious set of problems, which is that, Erica Huggins' husband was murdered by the police. There had been a group of Black Panthers who'd been murdered by the police in Chicago while they were asleep in their apartment. They were sound asleep and they were just gunned down. So it was quite a violent time. And there were a lot of right-wing people who wanted to turn anti-war, or in this case, justice, fair trial, peaceful protests into violent protests in order to discredit them. So the Peace Marshals worked very hard, and the Women's Center, the sisterhood, was very actively involved in this. We knew intuitively, I think, what the data later showed, which is that when young women approach armed men and offer them a flower or some kind words, it brings the level of tension and violence down. And so the sisterhood was very active in training the police marshals, and we also had a rotating slot on the strike committee where we tried to talk some of the men back from their rhetorical embrace of violence. And I must say we were extremely successful, with one major exception, and that is a small bomb was set off right before the Mayday events. The night before, there had been a very large rally at Ingles Rink, the hockey rink, and a small bomb was set off that night. No one was injured. And all those years, I carried this burden of, had we not been successful in making sure that everybody on the protester side understood how important it was to stay peaceful. And it turned out that John Dean, who was counsel to President Nixon, had slipped into New Haven under an alias, checked into the Taft Hotel, and after the rally, he had planted the bomb in order to discredit the Mayday peaceful protests. So,
Well, and I mean, Yale, I mean, 4 days after the Yale protests where no one was hurt is Kent
yes.
State, yeah, where 4 students were killed. So it really is a tribute to what was
And
accomplished at Yale.
and
But
if and Jackson State, where 8
yes, thank
people
you.
were killed.
Mhm.
So Mark, we've got a little over 15 minutes left. Do you want to field or send any questions our way? And so we can open that up to the audience. How do you want to do that?
Well, yeah, sure. First of all, to the audience, thank you very much for watching. And if you got any questions, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat button. Just type them in and I'll read them out loud. I'm not sure how I can top that John Dean story. I mean, did Maureen know about this? Um, uh, question for Elizabeth. First of all, when you, well, for all three of you, how many was in that first class? How many women were in that first class of 1969? And specifically for Elizabeth, you had mentioned when your first day there that you said, to quote, you were scared. What prompted that? Is that just you know, a kid away from home, or what went into that?
I think Anne can answer the question about the data. I don't know that.
Sure. So Yale admitted 575 women arrived at Yale that first fall, which sounds like a big number to us. But what you need to understand is that what Yale decided to do was spread these women out across its 12 residential colleges, which were, in a sense, for those of you who don't know Yale, like 12 separate schools. And so in each of these residential colleges, there's only about 25 of the women from each of the class, and that's from each class. So Connie and Elizabeth were 2 of only 25 women in Berkeley College, which is predominantly male. So 575, but for many of them, it felt like at times even that there was only a handful of them. But Elizabeth, why don't you, so that's the numbers, but you've got the story about why you felt afraid or uncomfortable.
Well, one of the many jobs I had to pay for my education was in the dining hall. And the dining hall I was working in, I was obviously very new. They weren't used to having Yale students who were women. The male Yale students bussed tables, but women who served in the dining hall, who were all from the town, from New Haven, and mostly Black, stood behind the steam table and dished out the food. So they put me with the women. And so I was standing there dishing out peas or mashed potatoes or whatever. And there was one new employee, a Black woman in the town, a young woman, and the dining hall manager first came up to me and called me into his office, and the senior older woman who ran the dining hall said, "Oh, no, she's a Yale student." And then he turned to the woman next to me who was also new and took her in the office. And I was very young and very naive, and I really didn't understand what was happening. But she came out, you know, a while later, and she was disheveled and her hair was messed up and she was crying. And the older black woman just embraced her and took her off to the ladies' room. And then when I asked, the older Black woman said, "You just shut your mouth. This doesn't concern you, and you'll just stir up trouble." So, you know, I figured out that something bad was going on, and it made me afraid. But it also made me feel angry, because when we took it to people in the Yale administration, they didn't care. And it's one of the reasons I was eager to participate in the founding of the sisterhood, the Yale Women's Center.
You know, I've never forgotten one of the things you said to me, Elizabeth, the first time we met and I interviewed you, because you come from a conservative Republican religious Midwestern family. And what you said to me was, Yale made me a feminist. And so it was yeah, your
Yeah,
experiences there.
I was a Dwight David Eisenhower Republican Party intern for the state of Illinois until about 2 days before I got to Yale. And then within about 2 weeks, this happened, and I became a feminist. And I've been a feminist ever since. Yale made me a feminist. Yale radicalized me in 2 or 3 weeks.
Can I just say that there are a lot of, I can, because I can see, most people, there are a lot of first women on.
There are, yes.
And I just want to acknowledge all of you and thank you for showing up. It's really wonderful. And I actually think I see some men, at least one man from that era. Yeah, I see him. So thank you for coming. And, if you feel like you want to just put your name in the chat box so we know you were here, that would be wonderful. So thanks very much. And the university chaplain's here too. I love you, Sharon. Great. The support, this is what it's about. The support is so fabulous amongst us. Yeah.
We have a question for both Elizabeth and Constance. Who were the people you considered allies, and how did you know that they were allies? How did they express their support of you and your presence at Yale? How did you know you could trust them?
So I'll start. So one of the things that you quickly find your cohort, and in addition to Elga Wasserman, who we, at least the women felt was our main supporter. She went to bat for us on every issue that she could, even though she was not herself as well treated as she should have been, but we didn't really know that at the time. We also were able to find cohorts elsewhere. So it was this is the 50th anniversary of a lot of things. So we actually made a mark, we women. 2019 and 2020 marked the 50th anniversary, not only of Mayday, but of the founding of the Afro-American Cultural Center, the House, the Asian American Cultural Center, the group, the Latino group, the sports groups, the music groups. I mean, this is how we survived. We found our people, as it were, and you find your people and you support your people, and vice versa. In the larger sense, in the group sense, and in this micro sense, you find your friends, and that's how you survive. The sad part, I think, what we found in the run up to and the events surrounding the reunion of the first women, which took place this past September, the 50th anniversary of our arrival at Yale, was that we really didn't know one another as well as we wished we had. And part of that was because we were separated out into the residential colleges, and we haven't had the chance in these past 50 years to really get to know each other, 575 of us. And this reunion was a really remarkable event, where new relationships, new bonds were made, and old ones renewed. Roommates who hadn't seen each other in 50 years, people who left Yale, didn't stay, came back because the reunion was open to everyone who put their feet on Yale's campus on that first day. And so it didn't matter if you didn't graduate. What mattered was that you were part of changing history. And that's what we did. We changed history. And we shared something that there are no other 575 women who did that. There are none, just us. And so I think that we survived that because we found the people who were our allies throughout it. And we're in the process still, 50 years later, of finding them anew or again. So I guess that would be my answer to that question.
I guess for me, it was a little different. I had to make a space where I could build alliances with the Women's Center, what's called the Women's Center now, the Sisterhood, and other political groups. There were a lot of teach-ins, and there were, I don't mean to say all the political groups were women. Most of the political groups were male, mostly men, because that's who was there. I found wonderful male friends and supporters and allies, from John Wilkerson, the dean at Yale College, on down to a really, really nice janitor whose name I've forgotten. And many of my classmates and other men. But I think the main characteristic is the willingness to listen to the stories that people are telling and to believe them. When they say they were raped, or when they say they were dismissed from a job, or when they say they were threatened by a police officer, the main thing I look for in an ally then and now, what I learned, was not necessarily that you believe them in the sense of every single detail, but you believe their truth, and you listen to their truth and share your truth with them. And then we can find a real human connection. Our Facebook page for the First Women, there are a lot of First Women here I see on the participants, and that Facebook page has been wonderful bringing us together too.
And this is for you. Wondering how the author selected the women to highlight in the book, and if the story would have been the same if she had selected different women. Were there women who would not participate? They were not interested in being interviewed. And if so, why?
When I first started this research, way back, maybe eight or 9 years ago, I thought of it as the experience, singular, of Yale's first women undergraduates. And as soon as I got into it, I realized that was wrong. It's the experiences, plural, of Yale's first women undergraduates, because every one of those women, because of their background, because of the residential college they landed in, because of their interests, had a different experience there. So yes, it would have been a different book if I had followed 5 different women. I really wanted to highlight the stories, though, of 5 women rather than tell the story from above, because I wanted people who read it to really be able to see and feel what it was like to be one of those women. And I couldn't do that if I did it in generalities. I wanted my daughter and her friends to read this book and understand what it felt like to be a woman in what had been a very, very male world. In terms of how I picked the women, so I started from the 50 women I had interviewed initially. For those women, I was looking both for a spread across the university in terms of where people were from, the residential colleges they were in, some racial diversity. I had hoped to find, and I did, women who were gay to interview. So I was trying to capture sort of the breadth of Yale. And then because my interest is change in institutions, I was particularly interested in women who were at the forefront of change. So someone like Elizabeth, who helped found the Yale Sisterhood, or Laurie Mifflin, who helped found one of Yale's first women's varsity sports, or Kit McClure, who was in an all-women's rock band, unheard of then, or Shirley Daniels, who was involved in the Black Student Alliance. And so it was those women on the edge of change that drew my interest. And then, and then part of it was I liked being able to have the connection between Connie and Elizabeth, to have the stories intersect somewhat, and then between Elizabeth and Kit, so it wasn't just 5 women who didn't know each other. And then some of it, I would say, is just I felt that I connected with the 5 women who become the heart of the book in a way that they would push back at me as an author if I didn't get something. I wanted, particularly Connie and Elizabeth are tough. So if I say something that they don't think I've got it right, they'll push back. And as an author, that's an incredible gift, because even though I went to Yale 8 years after they did, my Yale was very different than theirs. And it was important to me not to make false assumptions about what Yale was like when they arrived.
So if I could just jump in here, Anne is not only a graduate of Yale herself, but Anne and a PhD historian, but she was elected as the first woman ever to serve as editor-in-chief of the very prestigious Yale Daily News, and then went on to be among the first 6 or 7 years of women who were selected to become Rhodes Scholars. So Anne is, as remarkable or more remarkable than any of the Yale women that were in the book or left out of the book. And it makes my heart glad to see the younger generation succeeding.
That's very kind of you. I think I would disagree with you that I'm more remarkable, but I do think the story spoke to me in a way, because I had that experience of being a very young woman and having the New York Times write stories about me, and at least for me, that was sort of a disorienting experience. And so it was helpful to learn from other women and listen to them from that. So Mark, do we have time for any more questions, or do you need to wrap it up?
No, I'm good if you're good. We can extend this program a little while longer. The network will have no problem with that. There's a question here. I understand that there were conscious decisions about how to distribute the women around the college, as opposed to housing them all together in one residential college. What could Yale have done differently to introduce women to the college to make it more seamless? Any of the 3 of you, all 3 of you?
You guys want to go? You want me to go?
You go.
You go. So when Yale first decided to have women students, Yale's president, Kingman Brewster, proposed putting all of the women in one of Yale's residential colleges, Trumbull College. And there was a huge uproar among the men on the Yale campus about that. And in some of them thinking that wasn't good for the women because it would isolate them. It was like having a women's college, having a Radcliffe at Yale. And the idea was to put them on equal footing with the men. Some of them protested, many of them protested, because they wanted women in their residential college. They didn't want the women isolated there. And then the guys in Trumbull protested because they didn't want to have to move to other women's colleges, to other colleges and live. And so I think what could have been done is, and this is what Elga Wasserman, whom Connie referred to earlier, who was the woman given the unenviable position of leading the transition to coeducation at Yale, wanted to see the women in larger groups in a smaller number of residential colleges, and having the other colleges wait until there were more women on the Yale campus. Instead, what Yale did was go the entire different direction and spread those women out. And then there were never any events held to bring the women together. And I think that could have helped as well. I mean, this reunion that Connie talked about, and she was really fundamental in helping organize that reunion was the very first time for many of these women that they had ever been with any of the other first women undergraduates at Yale. And that's really just remarkable that it took 50 years for that to happen.
And let me just add, not only was Connie instrumental in helping to organize the 50th reunion for us, but she was instrumental in having one session, one panel during this weekend, where for the very first time ever, women in the first classes were allowed to speak, to stand up and speak to each other. We'd had reunions before, but we had always sat passively while members of the administration told us what it was like to co-educate Yale. This is literally true. And Connie, with, I might add, a little delicate encouragement from me, or support, insisted that we would have at least one session where the members of the first women class could stand up and tell each other our own stories in our own words, unmediated by a historian or an administrator, and talk and listen to each other. And it was the best panel of the weekend, and Anne chaired it.
Here's a topical question for all three of you. What elements of your experience would apply to women at Yale or colleges today, and what advice would you give them?
Well, you know, I was fortunate enough before the world changed to spend a lot of time in giving book talks across the country. And the thing I tend to tell young women is that they are far more powerful than they know they are. And that particularly if they join together for change, they can make remarkable things happen, just as these first women at Yale did. And so that's what I tell women.
And I would say the personal is political and sisterhood is powerful.
That sounds like something we were saying back in '69. So
Right on, baby.
It just confirms that nothing has changed.
It's the same. It's the same. We called it the Black Panthers. They call it Black Lives Matter. I mean, you gotta speak your truth. Speak power. You know, speak your truth to power. I am a huge believer in nonviolence, so I was always a voice for forceful protest, but always peaceful, because I think the political, you know, those who oppose whatever change you're trying to bring about will use any violence to discredit the underlying protest cause. So, and I think we're seeing this again, you know, that the protests are being undermined by people who are using the peaceful protests for their own opportunistic purposes. And it's just very hard to keep control of a large demonstration. It is, my heart goes out to the organizers of these peaceful protests, trying to maintain the peace. It is not easy. I've done it. It's not easy.
Is that a good note to end on?
I think so. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much, Elizabeth and Connie and all of our Zoom participants. It really is such an honor for me to have gotten to know some of these first women at Yale. They really are a personal inspiration to me, as I hope they are to you.
Well, my thanks to all three of you, to Anne, to Connie, to Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for taking your time, for being such gracious hosts and interviewers and interviewees. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Please get a copy of this book, Yale Needs Women, and support your local bookstore. Good night, everybody. And when our next lecture is on Thursday night, we hope you join us for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mark. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.